Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Bach and Todesbanden for the third and final time in a row, which translates to Christ lay in death's bonds. This is probably the least harmonically active of the three harmonizations of this particular melody that we've looked at over the last 3 days, but it does have some quirks here and there. Regardless, it follows a very similar structure to yesterday's chorale. You should check that out if you haven't already. It's a longer video, it's close to 40 minutes, but if you're just interested in comparing the analysis, maybe just skip ahead to the end of the video and look at how this chorale compares to yesterday's. We're just going to hop right into the analysis. If you've been following along day by day, the melody should be fairly familiar to you at this point. Hopefully so. If not, that's okay. One sharp in the key signature. We start on E minor. We end on E major. And although the overall tonality of this chorale is E minor, we start in B minor, just like we did yesterday. And this E minor chord would be a 4 chord with a passing 7th in the tenor. We then have F sharp, C sharp, F sharp, and A sharp. That is F sharp major, which is our 5 chord, passing 7th in the bass, and that takes us to B minor in first inversion, D, D, F sharp, and B, 1, 6. And then we have 4 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm, which indicates to me that we have a subdivided chord progression, that's for sure. Sorry if you hear that. There have been a lot of motorcycles driving past my apartment today. Not particularly sure why. But this C sharp, E, A sharp, C sharp chord is A sharp diminished over C sharp, which is a 7/6 chord. And if you've watched any of my past videos where this chord progression has popped up, you know what chord's going to come next. It's going to be a root position tonic triad, B, F sharp, B, and D. That's exactly what we get. We can expect Bach to write or resolve that chord progression that way pretty much every single time. Next chord we have is A sharp, F sharp, C sharp, and E natural, which is F sharp 7 over A sharp, which is 5, 6, 5. And that takes us right back to B minor, B, F sharp, B, and D, or tonic triad. We're closing in on this perfect authentic cadence here in the key of B minor, and our pre-cadential chord is F sharp major again, F sharp, A sharp, and C sharp, which is our 5 chord, another passing 7th in the tenor. And then we cadence on not B minor, but B major, B, D sharp, F sharp, and B. So Bach uses that Picardy third, and this is typically a device that's employed when Bach cadences in the key of the minor dominant to then foreshadow what's going to come next, or perhaps smooth the transition to the following key, which, if you can make an educated guess, is probably going to be our tonic E minor. And that's exactly what we get. But we don't modulate exactly immediately, like we don't modulate on the cadential chord like we do in some cases. We actually get a repetitious B major chord here, D sharp, B, F sharp, and B. Would technically be another tonic triad in first inversion, or you could analyze this as a direct modulation, or you could say the modulation occurs at the cadence. Whatever you feel is the most appropriate. I think they're all accurate analyses, but one of these B major chords is going to be our gateway to the key of E minor, turning it into a 5/6 chord. We then go to E minor, E, B, E, and G. That's what we would expect after a 5 chord, especially in first inversion. And then we get F sharp, A, D, and A. This is a little different from yesterday's chorale. This is a 7 chord, D major over F sharp, which is first inversion. Some people analyze this as 5/6 of 3 as well, depending on how genuine you feel the subtonic, how genuine of a role the subtonic plays in minor keys. I think 7 wanting to go to 3 via the cycle of falling fifths is enough of a justification, but sometimes I see this analysis. This is actually how they analyzed this subtonic 7th chords in the first textbook that I ever learned from, so I just like 7 a little bit better. I've come around to liking this analysis. It's just a little bit more succinct, and it makes just as much sense. But in this case, we are going to a 3 chord, G, G, D, and B. root position G major chord. And here's the interesting progression. We have a passing tone in the tenor, and we go directly to E minor, E, B, E, and A. This A being an accented non-chord tone, kind of functioning like a 4-3 suspension. But it's this G that's our chord tone, making this E minor, which is our tonic. 3 going to 1. Pretty interesting. It's not unprecedented. But this progression here, 1, 7, 3, 1, has kind of a modal or an old world feel to it. This isn't the only time we're going to see 3 going to 1, I believe. I think we see it one other time in this particular chorale. I might be mistaken though, but I won't get too ahead of myself. This sound is one that we'll get a little more familiar with as we look later on, so this is not just a one-off interesting progression. Bach repurposes it later on in the chorale as well. Fairly certain that he does, at least. And then we go to F sharp minor 7 flat 5. As we are preparing for a cadence, we would expect some type of pre-cadential chord, and 2 often fits that role. A, C, E, and F sharp. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential situations, and then we would expect that to go to some type of 5 chord, B, B, D sharp, and F sharp. That's B major, which is our 5 chord like we learned earlier, passing 7th in the tenor, and our perfect authentic cadence in the key of E minor concludes with E minor, E, G, B, and E, tonic triad, root position. And that concludes our A section. Now looking ahead, we have an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of G major, actually, so we do turn around, but we have modulation a little bit into this phrase. We have a bit of a zone here, and I've talked about modulation zones at length in my previous videos whenever they come up, but when you're dealing with relative keys, especially, in this case we're dealing with E minor and G major, because if you don't add any chromaticism to the E minor scale, you're dealing with all of the same chords, so where does the modulation happen? I mean, if you look in this phrase, there's no chromaticism, so is the entire phrase in G major? Is the entire phrase in E minor? We don't know. What we do know is that the cadence does take us to G major eventually, but where we modulate is largely nebulous and sort of a reflection based on the way that we hear it. All that we know is that there's some type of modulation that occurs at some point, and based on the way that I hear it, I think the modulation happens somewhere in the middle of the first measure of this phrase. But maybe you'll have a different opinion, and that's fine too. We have E minor to start things off, E, G, B, and E. No need to reanalyze. It's pretty much the exact same chord as the previous section. Passing 7th on the bass here, and then we get C major, C, G, E, and G. And I think this is actually where we modulate now that I'm looking at it, because of these interesting passing tones here. They're not particularly interesting, actually. I use the word interesting because in this moment they're more interesting to me than perhaps everything that's come before it or locally around it. But it seems to make sense here that this is where we modulate, and this is not a 4 chord. This is a 6 chord. However, in the key of G major, it is a 4 chord. That's what I meant. But we have a passing tone in the bass and, a neighbor tone. So 1 passing tone, 1 neighbor tone. And this, with the G being doubled here in the melody and the tenor, we have B, G, D, and G, which is our tonic triad in the key of G in first inversion. So 4 going to 1, 6. And I think this tonic triad is actually important because the chord that we have after our 4 chord, if we're excluding off of the harmonic rhythm, or chords that might be occurring off the harmonic rhythm, is A minor, A, C, E, and A, which in the key of G major is a 2 chord. 4 going to 2 for the same reason 3 going to 1 is kind of an unusual progression. It's kind of interesting that Bach breaks up the 2 chords with a chord that would logically come after 4, and 1 often does come after 4. So I think that 1 chord is actually playing a pretty significant role in the overall chord progression to separate the 2 predominant or just stable non-tonic functioning chords. We also have a passing tone in the bass before we get C, A, C, and E. That's just taking our A minor chord and inverting it, so we'll just change the figured bass. And we have another passing tone in the bass here before we get E, G, B, and G. That's E minor, which is our 6 chord. And it's kind of interesting because we have some transitive harmony here. 2 typically wants to go to 5, down a 5th, but here we see 2 going to 6, which is going up a fifth, and that's just approaching the dominant from a different direction. Some of the chord progressions just at like the local level, like 3 going to 1, 2 going to 6, gives this particular chorale some interest and I guess a little bit of charm too. But the 6 chord ends up being our predominant as opposed to 2, which is a much more common predominant chord in Bach's work, his chorales at least. We get F sharp, D, A, and A, which is D major in first inversion, so 6 going to 5, 6. And our imperfect authentic cadence concludes with G major, G, D, G, and B. Tonic triad, root position, 6, 5, 6, 1. Typically with imperfect authentic cadences, we get a myriad of different combinations of chords in the cadential context, as opposed to perfect authentic cadences where it's pretty much always a root position 5 chord going to a root position 1 chord, and what precedes it is typically some type of 2 chord, maybe a tonic triad, but it's generally a smaller pool of possible combinations that are drawn from, I guess. Imperfect authentic cadences aren't typically treated with the same level of rigidity. Moving forward, we do get some mid-phrase modulation here where Bach spends his time tonicizing E minor, or I'm making the argument that we are in the key of E minor. It just sounds E minor-like to me, both with the bass and the melody in conjunction with one another. And the alto as well, all things considered, right? It looks like 3, 2, 1 in E minor, 1, 2, 3 in E minor, 1 leading tone, 1 in E minor. There's no doubt in my mind that these first four beats, I guess, of the phrase are in E minor, and then Bach pivots to B minor towards the end in something that actually kind of sounds a little modal to me, because we go from this usage of D sharp here to D natural, then C sharp, so that flip of the context to B minor from E minor gives it a little bit of like an E Dorian vibe with the C sharp there, but no, it's definitely B minor. And it is also a perfect authentic cadence. But to start the phrase off, we have G, B, D, and B, which is another tonic triad, and I think this is where we modulate to the key of E minor. Bach has been using 3 chords to modulate quite a bit in the more recent chorales that we've been looking at, so I don't really feel as averse to analyzing them or talking about them at length anymore, but I think choosing 3 or choosing flat 7 as a chord to modulate between is kind of interesting, because typically we use more impactful or more frequently used chords like 4 or 5 or 2 to move between keys, or even the tonic. But after our 3 chord, we get 1, E, B, G, and E, again with this 3-1 progression that we saw earlier, G major to E minor. Here we see it again. After 1, we get F sharp, A, F sharp, and D sharp, kind of in a similar fashion to the second phrase here. We're getting a take on this same progression, but instead of getting subtonic 7-6, we're getting leading tone 7-6. And if you've seen this progression in the past, you know what's going to happen afterwards. We're going to get a tonic triad in first inversion. So instead of 3 here, we're getting G, B, E, and E, which is, like I mentioned, our tonic triad in first inversion. You could pretty much always expect Bach to realize this chord progression this way. If you see a tonic triad and a 7-6 chord, you know that the other inversion of the tonic triad, whether it be first inversion or root position, is going to be on the next beat, subdivided or otherwise. Like here we have a subdivided version, here we have one where the chord progression exists on the harmonic rhythm. But after our 1-6 chord, I do think this is where we move to the key of B minor. E minor becomes our 4-6 chord. We know that E minor is 4 in the key of B minor because we started on E minor in the key of B minor. And we quickly turn around to the key of B minor. So we have D, B, B and F sharp. That's B minor in first inversion, so another 4-1 progression here. Another passing tone in the bass before we get F sharp, B, and D natural. That's our tonic triad in second inversion. Another possible pre-cadential chord, kind of an accessory to 5 really, because they share a bass. Notice how F sharp is being sustained in pretty much both the tenor and the bass here. It looks like they're changing, but it's held here for 2 beats, or a beat and a half at least, and here it's just leaping down an octave, keeping the same pitch. but not the same frequency, and the other voice is just resolved down by half step. So after our 1-6-4 chord, we do go to 5, F sharp, A sharp, and C sharp, which is F sharp major. Sometimes we analyze this with a 5, yes, but a bracket underneath to show their relationship to one another. It's more a habit just from class or having taken or graded harmony for so many years. And we have a passing 7th in the tenor as well, leading us to our tonic triad, B, D, F sharp, and B, which is our tonic B minor. Looking ahead, we have another mid-phrase modulation, but this phrase ending here, kind of interesting in comparison to the ones that we've seen in the past. Here we have a bit of an ambiguous situation. I think there's an argument to be made for it being an imperfect authentic cadence. That's the way that I hear it. But there's also an argument to be made that it is a plagal cadence as well. I think both are just as valid as each other. But I think what we also have going on here is this is some type of subdominant cadence. And this is a term that I have not used in a while because they just haven't been popping up as frequently as they used to. But all in all, I'm going to talk about what a subdominant cadence is once we get to it. So we're actually going to be moving to the key of A minor through G major. So just like yesterday's chorale, we start off with E minor, E, B, G, and B, which is our... Apologies, I could say that this is E minor, but I think this B is actually an accented non-chord tone, and it's this C sharp here that is our tone that we're, I guess, focusing on here. And in the key of B minor, that would be our 2-6 chord, but if we're thinking about its function in the grander scheme of things, it's preceding a D chord, F sharp, A, and D, which is our 3 chord in the key of B minor. But I think really what's happening here is even though these numbers are spelling like an adjacent harmonic progression, C sharp is the leading tone to D. It's functioning like a dominant that is making D feel like the local tonic over the course of these 2 beats, but expressing it analytically as some type of tonicization, it's easier just to express in terms of B minor, because if you just play up a B minor scale, the 2 going to 3 is going to sound like 7 of 3 going to 3, or 7 of D going to D. And I think it's just by virtue of modulating from the key of B minor to G major that we create this progression. So we have the C sharp diminished chord here. We have this D major chord here. It's also in first inversion. Apologies for neglecting that before. We then have D major being 5 in the key of G major, so 3 turning into 5. Not the most common chord modulation that we see, but makes complete sense. And then we get focus on G major for pretty much the rest of the phrase. We have G, G, D, and B, which is G major in root position, B, G, D, and D, which is G major in first inversion. Passing tone in the bass here before we get D, F sharp, D, F sharp, C, and A, which is D7. It's a 5-7 chord in the key of G major. And then we get taken to E minor, E, G, B, and G. Maybe a little bit of a head nod to what was happening in yesterday's chorale and the chorale from the day before, where Bach was including these double suspensions here and turning a tonic triad, right, with the with the G and the B, and instead changing it to be a 6 chord because the inner voices were suspended. You should check out yesterday's video or the video from the day before if you're interested in seeing how that worked. But here we're just directly going to a 6 chord, and we're not quite yet in the key of A minor. In my opinion, you could analyze this E minor chord as a minor 5 in the key of A minor. You can analyze this D7 chord as a major subdominant 7 in the key of A minor, but to me it really doesn't sound like it modulates until right before the cadence, which is a hallmark of a pattern that Bach used in his earlier, or at least the chorales that were earlier in the BWV numbers, subdominant cadence. So we start here with F sharp, A, E, and F sharp. This E right here, I believe, is an accented non-chord tone, or rather a suspension, right? It's like a 7/6 suspension over the bass, and this D appears to be our chord tone here, which would make this a D major chord in first inversion. That's 4/6. And then we get taken to 1, a D and E, but this D is another suspension here. This time it's a 4/3 suspension, but it's still our tonic triad. So if we look exclusively at what's happening on the harmonic rhythm strictly, it's a plagal cadence, right? 4 going to 4, 6 going to 1. But something that we know about 4/6 progressions going to 1 in this ascending configuration in Bach will always connect the base of the 4/6 chord to the base of the tonic triad, and he uses in most cases the leading tone to do so. And that's exactly what this G sharp is in the key of A minor. And I think the role that this G sharp plays is not one that is fully voiced, right? We don't have a complete 7 chord here or a complete 5 chord here, but it is being alluded to because the leading tone of the chord is in the bass, and that's what makes it feel more like an imperfect authentic cadence to me. And something that I neglected to do was analyze the modulation. This D major chord in first inversion is actually 5/6, just like we saw earlier, 6 going to 5/6, this time in the key of G major. But this 5/6 chord in the key of A minor is a major 4/6. Sorry, I was getting ahead of myself there. 5/6 turning into 4/6. This is a modulation that we've seen with some frequency in Bach. It surprised me the first time I saw it. I thought it was very crafty, but then I realized, oh, Bach harmonizes melodic minor a lot. This is a modulation technique that he uses with frequency, so not something to really be oohing and awing about every single time. But 4/6 going to 1, I think this is an imperfect authentic cadence because of the presence of the leading tone here. It feels like, even though there isn't a full chord, it feels like there's some type of dominant role that's being resolved to the tonic. And the reason, why is this a subdominant cadence? Well, ultimately speaking, A minor gets sprung up on us right at the last second, literally the beat right before the cadence, which is something that's a hallmark of these subdominant cadences that I had analyzed in the past that were very, very common. We were seeing them every couple of chorales, sometimes in consecutive chorales, and where that might be coincidental. Here we're seeing kind of it almost feels like a brief tonicization of A minor, and in this case actually this wouldn't be a subdominant cadence, this would be a supertonic cadence, but it's the same gesture. The reason why I called it a subdominant cadence has to do with the fact that Bach typically did this with 4 chords, right? So if this were a subdominant cadence in terms of G, it would be in the key of C major, but here we're seeing it in A minor, which coincidentally is relative to C major, but it's the 2 of the scale. But it's the exact same premise that Bach flips the script and cadences in a fashion that almost feels like all he's doing is tonicizing a chord rather than actually modulating to the key. So it really feels like we're getting like 4 of 2, 7 of 2, 2 rather than 1. But I think there's enough context here in order for us to say that maybe a brief modulation is going on, just like in the case of all of the other subdominant or supertonic cadences we've seen in the past. But ultimately, in preparation for our last cadence, we're just going to see this A minor turn into a chord tone in terms of E minor, right? Because in the key of E minor, A minor is 4. We start things off immediately in the key of E minor in the next phrase because we start off with B. D sharp, F sharp, B, and B, which is B major over D sharp. That's a 5/6 chord with a passing tone in the alto before we get B, F sharp, D sharp, and A. It's another B major chord of some sort, but this time we have the 7th, and it's in root position, so we'll just change the figure bass to reflect that. And we would expect that to go to E minor, which it does. E, G, E, and G. 2 roots and 2/3, which is kind of an interesting spelling. We don't see it all that often, but it's not unprecedented. This A is a non-chord tone here, kind of hinting at like an A minor 7 vibe, but there's no C happening at the same time, so it's not really worth analyzing on the page. But as we're getting ready for our final cadence, which is a perfect authentic cadence in the key of E minor, we get B major, B, B, D sharp from earlier, and F sharp, which is our 5 chord, passing 7th in the tenor again, just like how we started, and then we cadence on E major, E, G sharp, B, and E, which is our major tonic triad. As Bach often does in his minor chorales, he ends with the Picardy third. So takeaways from this particular chorale: the 3-1 progression is pretty interesting. We have some mid-phrase modulations, right? E going to B, G going to A, which results in a supertonic cadence in this instance. But other than that, harmony is fairly straightforward. This chorale setting is quite a bit plainer than the ones that we've seen in the last couple of days. Just as you can see, we have large swaths of chorale here that don't have any passing tones, any non-chord tones really. The harmony is relatively straightforward from a visual standpoint as well. Sometimes the harmony, I guess you don't realize how straightforward the harmony is until you analyze it, but on the page you see all these non-chord tones, you see a lot of counterpoint, and your first assumption is this is probably going to be a very harmonically complicated chorale, which for all intents and purposes it is, but the harmony and being able to pull it out of the texture is not as complicated as you often think. But in this case, a relatively plain chorale. It's interesting to see all the variations and different takes that Bach had on this particular text and melody, and I think I'm going to end the video on that note. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. If you're interested in following me along on this journey to analyze all of the chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well if you'd like to be notified of my daily upload, and you could also like the video if you enjoyed the content. It helps me out as a content creator and helps my videos get seen by more people. Thank you so much for watching the video again. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.